Okay. In yesterday's video, we met the leaders of Clan Pestilence, a towering demon and the conniving priests beneath him. Well, they make up an extremely small portion of that faction, believe it or not. The vast bulk consisting of billions with a B come from the church's twisted congregation. And today we're going to explore them in detail. Starting at the lowest tier of the ladder, I guess you could say, are the humble, not so humble because they're Skaven, plague monks. Now, at the beginning of the week, we mentioned a few things about the Skaven. Their seemingly endless numbers, and their propensity for cowardice. Like regular Skaven, plague monks can seem to come in endless hordes. Larger congregation can have, again, billions with a B. Collectively, they form the main fighting force of the church, or just the Clan Pestilence. The second thing to touch on is cowardice. See, this usually keeps Skaven attacks in check. If you break the spirit of the army, you break the army itself. But plague monks, while they're not fearless, are much harder to break. They're kind of show their fear in a different way. Because introduced to the idea of Clan Pestilence is religious zealotry, and this amplifies the threat. They still run away if you kill enough of them, but they're more reckless with their lives. Therefore, they do more damage. Because they have zero defense, they throw themselves wholeheartedly into battle, frothing with disease, and they're considered bold and daring by so many other Skaven. The plague monks dress up in tattered robes that are encrusted with all kinds of filth and nastiness. They are adorned with strange religious symbols and artifacts all around them. They wield sharp objects that are basically generous to call them knives. Could be shards of metal, something sharp they found on the ground. Regardless, they kind of dip them in nastiness, and so the idea being they just have to nick you. If they nick you, then you will get that wound infected, and within a little while, even if you win the battle against Clan Pestilence, you'll die later on from the infection. And again, think of this is a horde army, and it's all based around this unit, and we'll come back to it at the end because there's a point that I really want to make about it. But this is the iconic and seminal unit for the army. This is the teeming masses that show up and fight because of their religious devotion. Now, next up are the Plague Censer Bearers. These can be roughly considered the elite troops of the clan, if that exists. And there's really two ways to make a Plague Censer Bearer. You take a Plague Monk who is holy and devout, or you take a slave who is given a choice between serving and death. The priest loads up a brass sphere with his current batch of contagion. They make the Skaven go rabid and then loose him on the battlefield. What you get is a killing machine. He's stuck in a delirious killing frenzy, spreading this bioweapon, the censer that's unloading this toxic stuff in the air, swinging it around like a mace, just dripping toxicity and death everywhere, to the point where you can't really fight one without illness taking hold mid-battle. Of course, the eventuality is that the Plague Bearer Censer will fall to the disease as well, and he'll kind of crumble into mulch and die. But the censer is retrieved until a similar fate befalls another faithful or prisoner. They are cheered on and invigorated by plague monks who see them as idols of religious fervor, bearers of the cleansing contagion. They're a fascinating thing. I hesitate to say that they're an elite troop because they really are basically just plague monks that are more specialized when it comes to how they attack things. In-game, they still have no save, like they're still wearing just nothing but cloth, running headlong at the enemy with nothing to protect them but their faith. Now, there are two units left in the army, but there's very little lore about them, so I will touch on what there is. These are the War Machine type-ish units, the Plague Furnace and the Plagueclaw Catapult. The Plague Furnace is one of the big centerpiece units of the army. And as I said in yesterday's video, a lot of times a priest will ride atop of one and kind of lead the charge into battle. They are super crude wagons from rotted wood and rusted bolts and things like that, and that is where they choose to preach the gospel, I suppose you would say, of the Great Horned Rat, invigorating the faithful and cursing the enemy. Maintaining a giant censer, one of those things, it's a big hollow ball they load up with all kinds of disease and nastiness on the wagon. So beforehand, it's Again, loaded up with terrible, terrible things, and you can see it on the model, this billowing cloud of nastiness. And it really functions similar to the Plague Censer Bearer. It turns disease into a physical weapon that you can bring to the enemy. But the devastation this can cause is on a much greater scale. More toxicity and a more focused point can be ridiculously good. And they heave it into battle by hordes of plague monks gathering around it and just pushing with all their might. Now, with enough plague monks pushing and stuff like that, you can manage to get some good speed, and right before the enemy lines, they shove it as hard as they can and just launch this thing straight into the battle line, hurling itself into the enemy, crushing them under rusted wheels and jagged spikes. Of course, the whole time the priest is on top of that thing, bringing curses and prayers down upon the enemy to wither them away. And the last unit here is the Plagueclaw Catapult. These crude, scaffold-like catapults follow in the rear of the army, but don't let kind of their position on the battlefront fool you. These really are seen as holy weapons, bringers of the great corruptor's gift, able to hurl toxins and diseases and rot over the highest castle walls or a huge clump of enemies. And they kind of are instrumental to the kind of quote-unquote modern, I guess you could say for Skaven efforts, war effort. It's considered an incredible blessing to man such a machine, because those who are saturated with such filth become one with the divine. Of course, this is when you're shoveling the disease and nastiness onto the actual catapult arm, and you fire it off into the enemy. They're a vital instrument in achieving the Great Hornrat's mission in the realms. And that's really it for the lore of the Plagueclaw Catapult, but consider it really that how horrific these things must be. Imagine a Clan Pestilence army arrives at your fort, and you seal the doors and you're kind of coming up with a battle plan. You hear the endless sounds and chants of this crazy religious thing outside going on. And not just prayers like that, but also like chittering and scraping, and they're probably digging into the earth to try and get you. All these terrible noises are driving you mad. But you feel somewhat secure in your fortress until huge heaps of waste and refuse and rot are hurled into the center of your castle or fortification. And with that, as things kind of escalate and more of it arrives, people are getting sick, you realize that your walls to defend you have just become a trap with you inside. They can rot out a fortification from the inside out. Now, why are these units cool? Again, there's not much of them in terms of like the numerical amount of how many units there are, and there's not really a ton of lore on each one of them. But here's the thing, they all kind of follow the same themes. Religious devotion, they're better in numbers, and they're all about bringing disease, which is kind of an abstract thing, to the enemy in kind of a weapon form, whether the rusty knives of the plague monks or hurling stuff across the battlefield with the Plagueclaw Catapult. But how they do this on the tabletop is where it gets interesting, and I'm going to do a deeper dive about the playstyle and stuff like that of Clan Pestilence in a bit, but I wanted to comment on just bringing lore to the tabletop. The Plague Censer Bearers and the Plague Furnaces, they're built around plague monks. They need them to move or be more effective. And it's easy to see a large horde of troops for cheap and say, oh, that's a horde army, right? You just write that off in your mind. It happens a lot with a lot of these armies. You go, oh, that's an easily spammable troop with a large maximum number of models. Must be a horde army. But in this case, the horde is what makes everything else function. It needs them, but also they need it. Just plague monks won't take down everything. They need the furnace to do the mortal wounds, and they need the priests to debuff their enemies. And for all this book's faults, how it may have fallen behind or kind of been victim to being one of the earlier Battletome releases and things have kind of evolved, and the game has kind of evolved around them, I'll admit that. This, to me, is the best example of what a horde army should be. It was designed from the ground up with plague monks at the forefront. They define its character, its effectiveness, and its competitiveness. And I think other books should take a lesson from it. And the first thing that comes to my mind is Moonclan Garrots, which is kind of in a rumor, we know it's coming but not here yet place. You don't just take plague monks because they're a troop choice in this faction, but because they're the heart and soul of it, both in lore and literally in gameplay. And I think the idea of not only having horde units that are cheap and spammable and all that stuff like that, but making them so integral to everything else is what makes this a thematically horde-like army. But tell me what you think. I want to hear your thoughts about this. Do you like how integral that one unit is to everything else? That they make the Plague Furnace move, that they allow the Plague Censer barriers to be far more effective and such like that. Some people really don't like the way synergies work when you're dependent on a unit, especially one with literally no save. They still have a dash for a save. I thought we were past that, but we're not. That's okay. And I want to hear your thoughts about it. Now, in tomorrow's video, we're going to kind of touch on some of the more cool aspects of the army. Specifically about how it plays on the tabletop. We'll go over some war scrolls, some notable things that new players might want to know about, as well as go over the General's Handbook rules. So thank you all so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in tomorrow's video. As always, happy wargaming. Hey Wargamers, thank you so much for watching that video. Be sure to hit subscribe and click the little bell notification icon so you're alerted to all new videos coming out.